Mark glanced at the clock in the waiting room for the third time in under a minute. His appointment was scheduled for 2 p.m, and it was now 2 minutes past. The passing seconds felt like an eternity, and his mind started conjuring up reasons why the appointment might be canceled. Perhaps Dr. Aris had an emergency and left the office. Perhaps they'd double-booked, and he'd be asked to reschedule. Deep down, he knew there was no real cause for panic, just that old anxious knot tying itself inside his chest, twisting each breath into something short and unsteady. He tried a simple breathing technique he'd read about online. Inhale for 4 counts, exhale for 4 counts. Focus on the sound of each breath. It steadied him somewhat. The thick beige carpet under his shoes felt oddly comforting, and he allowed his gaze to drift across the room. 2 other individuals sat quietly, each absorbed in their own reading. A clock ticked on the wall. The faint hum of the air conditioning made for a low, constant white noise. Just as Mark started to imagine fleeing to the hallway for fresh air, the door to the office opened. A bespectacled receptionist with a patient smile stepped out. "Mr. Gray?" she asked, scanning the waiting area. Mark nodded, immediately feeling self-conscious at the apparent volume of his own heartbeat. He stood and followed her down a short corridor lined with framed motivational quotes, calming messages about finding inner strength and the importance of confronting challenges head-on. At the far end, a door stood slightly ajar. The receptionist gestured for him to step inside. He found himself in a room softly lit by a floor lamp, the smell of lemon-scented candles wafting through the air. The walls were a gentle cream color, decorated only by a few neatly placed bookshelves. In the center stood 2 plush chairs facing each other. One was already occupied by a figure in a sleek blouse and tailored trousers, Dr. Aris. She offered him a warm, encouraging smile and gestured for him to take the seat opposite her. "Mark, it's good to see you again," she said. Her tone was calm, carrying an undercurrent of empathy that Mark had found comforting since his first visit. "Thanks," he replied, clearing his throat. I'm sorry I was a bit late getting in here." "You're right on time," she assured him. "Shall we begin?" Mark nodded and sank into the comfortable chair, resting his elbows on its soft armrests. The tension in his shoulders flared slightly, but he tried to hold himself steady. He had come here specifically to try a new approach: hypnotherapy. Traditional counseling had helped in many ways, but he still found himself struggling with episodes of intense anxiety. He hoped this approach might do the trick, or at least unlock another route toward the calm he desperately craved. Over the next few minutes, they revisited the usual disclaimers: how hypnotherapy wasn't a magical cure, how any progress depended on his willingness to follow the process. She asked him if he was comfortable with the environment, the lighting, the temperature. He assured her that he felt fine. His heart thumped, but that was normal for him. "I'm going to guide you into a state of deep relaxation," she explained, meeting his eyes. "Think of it as a guided meditation with a focus on images and scenarios we believe could be key to addressing your anxiety. Sound good?" Mark swallowed. "Yes, let's do it." "All right. Breathe in," she said softly. "Close your eyes. Let yourself sink into the sound of my voice." He did as she asked, letting his eyelids fall shut. He sensed himself drifting into a looser mental space. Her words felt like gentle waves rolling over him. She counted backward from 10, encouraging him to drop deeper into that relaxed state with each count. The steady rhythm of her voice lulled him, quieting the swirl of thoughts that so frequently rumbled in his head. "There's a beach in your mind," she guided. "A tranquil shoreline you can walk along. Notice the color of the sky, the warmth of the sand between your toes." He imagined that beach so vividly, it almost took his breath away. The soft hush of the ocean, the way the sky glowed with pastel streaks. It was more vivid than any daydream he'd experienced. Perhaps it was the environment of the office, soft lighting, gentle voice, minimal distractions, but he felt transported. "Now," said Dr. Eris, her voice even and steady, "look ahead and see a figure in the distance. This figure represents a supportive presence, one you can talk to. Approach them, notice any details about them." Mark felt his imagination intensify. He moved along that beach in his mind, and there indeed stood a figure on the shoreline. As he drew closer, his heart fluttered with an odd sense of anticipation. The figure wore a light dress that billowed gently in the breeze, hair grazing the shoulders, and a calm expression that radiated empathy. In that hypnotic state, Mark recognized that this figure wasn't just a random person. It felt like a reflection, a piece of himself. He heard Dr. Eris guiding him, telling him to focus on what the figure might represent, how it made him feel. The figure turned, and through the dreamlike haze, Mark realized he was looking at a version of himself, but in a woman's form. Her features were distinct, but unmistakably his own beneath the surface. She smiled, and though he felt an initial flicker of surprise, there was nothing threatening about her presence. "Take a moment to sense what she embodies," came the calm instructions from somewhere behind his closed eyelids. "Does she make you feel relaxed, safe? Maybe there's a name that resonates with you." He heard a name in his mind, though it was faint at first. It came through like a whisper. "Maria," he finally murmured. "Good, Mark," said Dr. Eris in that reassuring tone. "Keep focusing on her. Notice any emotions that surface." In the recesses of his hypnotic state, the woman, Maria, reached out to him, and he felt a wave of warmth wash over him. That weight of anxiety that usually pressed against his chest lifted ever so slightly. The ocean breeze around them felt comforting, the smell of salt air strangely soothing. After some moments, the session began to wind down. With the gradual counting upward from 1 to 10, Mark felt the grip of the hypnotic state loosen. Slowly, he opened his eyes, as though returning from a deep dream. And yet, the memory of Maria lingered, a vivid impression he couldn't shake. "How do you feel?" asked Dr. Eris, observing him with professional curiosity. He blinked a few times, noticing his pulse was calmer than usual. "Better, a bit spaced out," he admitted, "but also relaxed. It was so real." She smiled, leaning forward slightly. "Visualization can be an effective tool, especially for deep anxiety work. You mentioned the figure's name was Maria?" "Yeah," he rubbed his temple. "I'm not really sure where that came from. It just felt right." "That's okay. Names hold power sometimes. They help us connect with parts of ourselves we don't typically access in day-to-day life. Maria might be symbolizing a quality or trait that helps you feel grounded." Mark considered that, nodding slowly. He didn't feel threatened or unsettled by the experience. In fact, it had been oddly comforting. They spoke for a few more minutes about the details. She encouraged him to journal about the experience. Then they agreed to meet the following week to delve a little deeper, if he was willing. Outside, the sun was dipping behind the office building. Mark stepped onto the sidewalk with a curious lightness in his step. He had come in with tension racking his entire frame, but now he felt an unfamiliar calm, as though a gentle filter had been placed between him and the world's usual noise. That night, he couldn't shake the memory of Maria. Lying in bed, he found himself replaying her soft expression, her calm demeanor. He recalled how, in that dreamlike setting, she'd been a soothing presence. He closed his eyes and tried summoning that same mental image. To his surprise, it was easy to recall, almost like flipping a switch and returning to the beach. The image comforted him enough to lull him into a sound sleep. The days that followed were marked by the usual routine: work, errands, calls with his sister, attempts at unwinding at home. Yet something remained different. In anxious moments, Mark found his thoughts flickering to Maria. He'd close his eyes at his desk, picturing her serene face. Sometimes, just conjuring that image seemed to settle the palpitations that otherwise might have escalated. One afternoon, while he was in his apartment, he felt an unexplainable urge he'd never truly experienced. He found himself thinking, Maria wore a dress in his visualization. He remembered how light it looked, how airy. Without fully understanding why, Mark felt drawn to that image in a tangible way. A spontaneous thought suggested, maybe wearing something similar to what Maria wore might help him replicate the calm. He brushed it off at first, thinking it strange. He'd never had a particular inclination to try on women's clothing, but that memory from the hypnotherapy kept surfacing, telling him it might be worth exploring. He didn't own any such clothing, and the thought of going out to purchase a dress felt daunting. But the idea remained in his mind like a small, unspoken beacon. Eventually, on a weekend when he had time to himself, he resolved to at least visit a store, see if it would spark something. That morning, he drove to a quiet shopping center in a neighboring part of town, where he was less likely to run into acquaintances. His heart pounded as he entered a boutique. Bright overhead lights illuminated racks of airy dresses, neat skirts, and stylish blouses. A small part of his mind screamed that this was wrong or too unusual, but his curiosity and the memories of Maria guided him forward. He approached a rack of summer dresses, running his fingers along the soft fabric of a flowing garment in pale blue. "Looking for a gift?" asked a store clerk who approached with a polite smile. Mark coughed awkwardly, eyes shifting. "Yes, for a friend," he managed. Then, feeling an odd boldness take over, he said, "She's about my size, so I'm trying to guess what might fit her." "That can be tricky," the clerk said kindly. "Would you like to try anything on, just to get a sense of length or fit?" His cheeks warmed. He nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "Yes, please. That'd be helpful." He picked out the pale blue dress and another piece that caught his eye, then followed the clerk to the fitting rooms. Once he was alone in that small space, fluorescent lights overhead, he closed the door and hung the dresses on a hook. With trembling fingers, he pulled his t-shirt over his head. He could practically hear his pulse drumming in his ears. He slipped on the pale blue dress and took in his reflection in the mirror. At first, the awkwardness clung to him, broad shoulders not quite suited to the garment's cut, the unfamiliar feeling of the soft material. But something else ignited beneath the surface. A spark of that inner calm flickered through him. It was reminiscent of being on that hypnotic beach, as though some part of Maria was emerging into his everyday world. The swirl of the skirt around his legs coaxed a gentle hush over the usual anxiety that plagued him. He stood there for a few long moments, just letting his eyes linger on the reflection. He didn't look exactly like the Maria in his visualization, but the feeling was more important. It was as though wearing the dress granted him a closeness to that part of himself that he'd met under hypnosis. He realized his breathing had grown easier, more measured. Eventually, he changed back, cheeks still flushed. He left the store with the pale blue dress and a skirt he'd impulsively decided to buy, his mind a whirlwind. Once he got home, he didn't waste time. He drew the blinds, locked the door, and put on the dress in front of his bedroom mirror. Again, the tension in his chest lessened, like pressure releasing from a tight valve. He even experimented with a different posture, letting his weight rest on one hip, noticing how the fabric moved when he took gentle steps. That evening, he journaled about his experience as suggested by Dr. Aris, though he was hesitant to write out every detail. He wasn't sure how she would react to his newfound behavior. The cross-dressing might have seemed out of the blue to someone who didn't know the powerful effect Maria had on him. He wrote a careful line. "I found a tangible way to feel the same calm I experienced in the session." Even he recognized that the clothes were acting like a bridge to that hypnotic tranquility. At his next appointment, Mark hesitated to bring up his shopping trip. He and Dr. Aris sat in the same soft chairs, the same gentle lighting overhead. She began by asking how he'd felt since the last session. "I've had fewer intense anxiety episodes," he admitted, fiddling with his sleeve. "I mean, I still feel them lurking, but there's a new technique I've been using." She nodded with interest. "Tell me about it." Taking a breath, he tried to remain composed. "Remember Maria? I realized that, well, I tried wearing something that reminded me of how she looked in my visualization, and it made me feel calmer." She absorbed his words carefully, pausing a moment. "You've been dressing to resemble her?" "In a small way," he clarified. "Mostly it's just at home. I put on something similar to that flowing dress from our session. And weird as it may sound, it helps. The anxiety calms down." A thoughtful expression crossed her face. "I don't see that as a negative, Mark. We're working on opening your mind to deeper aspects of yourself that might soothe your anxiety. If dressing as Maria helps, that could be an important aspect of our work." Though he'd braced for criticism or shock, all he saw on her face was understanding. He felt a wave of relief. They dove further into how that feeling manifested, dissecting the sense of calm he experienced when he wore clothes that felt feminine. Eventually, the conversation steered toward another guided session. She asked if Mark felt comfortable revisiting the hypnotic state and exploring his subconscious imagery again. Intrigued by the remarkable effect it had on him last time, he nodded. He settled back, closed his eyes, and let her counting and soothing voice guide him. This time, when he found himself on that mental beach, Maria stood closer. She wore the same airy dress, the skirt fluttering around her legs. She reached out her hand, and Mark, in that dreamlike space, felt more connected to her than ever. He let his mind explore what it meant to embody her traits. It felt natural, comforting, like a friend reminding him to take a deep breath. When the session ended and he returned to normal awareness, a lingering peace enveloped him. "Maria seems to be an effective gateway to the calm we want to cultivate," observed Dr. Aris, scribbling some notes. "How do you feel now?" "Relaxed," he said quietly. "I wasn't prepared for how strong that feeling would be." They wrapped up the session, and Mark drove home, replaying the imagery of Maria in his mind. A part of him already looked forward to the next chance he might have to put on the dress in the privacy of his apartment. In the days that followed, he began wearing the dress for short intervals whenever the stress of the day piled up, perhaps after a grueling call at work or an argument with a colleague. He'd come home, change clothes, and feel a wave of relief. He found it almost meditative. Sometimes he allowed himself to imagine he was Maria, gliding softly over a mental shoreline, far from life's stressors. He'd walk around his apartment, quietly reflecting on the shift in posture, the subtle shift in mindset. An unexpected complication arose, though. The difference between real life and that calm feeling he associated with cross-dressing began to weigh on him. At work, the usual triggers for anxiety still dogged him. He would sip coffee at his desk, body tense, mind wandering back to the memory of the airy fabric and the mental presence that had soothed him. His boss or co-workers would bring him tasks, chat about deadlines, ask for updates, and he'd nod along. But inside, he felt a longing for the tranquility he could achieve only when wearing Maria's dress. He also became more aware of how alone he felt in this process. It wasn't something he felt comfortable sharing with friends or family, fearing they wouldn't understand. He had no roadmap for how to talk about this development, so he kept it tucked away in secrecy, the cross-dressing at home growing more frequent as he sought that sense of calm. A few times he considered trying to do it outside the apartment. The idea both excited and unnerved him. He stared at his reflection in the mirror, wearing the skirt or the dress, wondering if he could pass as a woman in public, or if that was even what he wanted to do. It was complicated. He liked the calm that this clothing seemed to grant him, but stepping outside like that was a more daunting scenario. Ultimately, he convinced himself that the risk was too high. The world outside felt full of too many unknowns. Instead, he stuck to brief but potent moments in his apartment, alone. At his next few sessions, he and Dr. Aris continued to explore the concept of Maria. Dr. Aris remained supportive, but she did ask the occasional probing question, such as whether Mark saw this as a permanent aspect of his identity or more of a tool. He didn't have a definitive answer. He only knew that Maria's presence, both in the hypnotic sessions and in the cross-dressing, helped him quiet an anxiety that had plagued him for years. On the fourth session since the initial hypnotherapy, Mark hesitated in the waiting room, bracing himself for a conversation he felt was overdue. When he entered the office, he approached the subject as soon as they were seated. "I need more sessions focusing on Maria," he stated, trying to keep his voice steady. "It's the only thing that's given me real relief from these anxious cycles." "All right," she said, watching him closely. "Do you mean more frequent sessions?" He nodded. "I'd like to dive deeper. It's like every time we finish, I feel the best I've ever felt. Then, once I'm out in daily life, I struggle more and more. I want to figure out if it's possible to sustain that sense of calm outside of hypnosis." She tapped her pen softly against her notebook. "We can certainly try, but I want to be sure you're not relying too heavily on one single strategy. We want to give you multiple ways to manage anxiety." He felt a flare of defensiveness, though he tried to tamp it down. "I don't disagree," he said, "but this is working, more than anything else ever has." "All right," she replied. "We can explore it. But let's proceed carefully. We need to maintain a balanced approach." Mark exhaled. "Thank you." That day's session went deeper than previous ones, with her guiding him through a more extended visualization. In the hypnotic landscape, he spoke to Maria, watching her lips move as she offered quiet reassurances he couldn't quite articulate consciously. He tried to memorize every detail of her posture, the tilt of her head, the measured cadence of her voice. He emerged from it feeling renewed, as though his mind had been scrubbed clean of tension. However, as soon as he left the office, the high began to fade. Navigating traffic, responding to urgent notifications on his phone, dealing with a tense phone call, each real-world intrusion threatened to unravel that calm. By the time he reached his apartment, he was desperate to slip on the pale blue dress and conjure that serene mental space again. He started scheduling sessions weekly, sometimes even twice a week if his schedule allowed. He'd leave messages at the office. "Hi, it's Mark again. Can I squeeze in a session earlier if there's a cancellation?" He sensed a slight wariness in the receptionist's voice after a while. But whenever he got in front of Dr. Aris, her professional composure never faltered. She would ask how he was doing, and he would detail the rising anxiety he experienced when not tapping into Maria. She would guide him back into the hypnotic process, occasionally reminding him to explore other coping mechanisms as well: mindfulness, exercise, journaling. But none of those methods provided the same profound relief that dressing in Maria's style or returning to her presence in hypnosis did. Over the ensuing weeks, Mark's reliance on these sessions grew. He caught himself daydreaming at work about scheduling yet another appointment. More than once, he even pretended to be sick or needed elsewhere so he could leave early. He'd return to the solitude of his apartment, pull out the blue dress, and attempt to recapture that deep calm on his own. One Friday, after a particularly stressful meeting at the office, he requested a last-minute session and managed to secure a spot late in the day. When he arrived at the building, the sky was already turning a dusky gold. Inside, the waiting room was empty, the receptionist gone for the day. The quiet halls led him to the softly lit office where Dr. Aris waited. She welcomed him in, though her expression seemed a touch more guarded than usual. "Mark," she began, once they were seated, "I want you to know that you can always ask for an appointment if you need it. But I'm beginning to sense some tension around how much you're relying on these sessions." His chest tightened defensively. I need them," he said, trying to keep his voice from shaking. "I feel like I'm barely holding it together when I'm not connected to Maria." She nodded sympathetically. "I hear you, and I'm glad we've found something that helps so profoundly. But I also want to ensure we're investigating other ways for you to feel stable." He clenched his jaw. "You keep bringing that up, and I understand. But you have no idea how overwhelming everything feels when I'm not in that state. I spent years trying medication, talking to other therapists. Nothing worked like this." Her face softened. "I can't claim to fully know your experience, Mark, but as your therapist, I have to ensure we strike a healthy balance. The goal is for you to live with less anxiety day to day, not to make you dependent on one single method." Despite her gentle tone, her words unsettled him. He felt an impulse to snap back, to insist that she didn't comprehend how vital Maria's presence was. Yet he bit back that frustration, reminding himself that she was trying to help. They went through another round of the usual process, counting down, drifting into relaxation. This time, when Mark arrived at that mental beach, he felt a tremor of desperation, as though everything hinged on this contact with Maria. He watched her approach, the breeze stirring her hair. But oddly, the scene felt slightly strained, as though his own agitation was seeping into the dreamscape. He tried to push away his worries and focus on her gentle presence. When the session ended, he felt only partial relief. He stood, blinking under the office lights, every nerve in his body on edge. She asked how he felt, and he responded with a vague, "Okay." They made a plan for next week, and Mark left the building in a swirl of conflicting emotions. Back at his apartment, he paced the living room. It felt like there was a line dividing his life. On one side was the calm he associated with Maria, and on the other was the daily storm of demands, tasks, and social expectations. He wanted those sides to converge, but he wasn't sure how. The cross-dressing at home brought fleeting relief, but each day he felt more isolated, uncertain whether to confide in others. He even drafted a text to a close friend about it, but deleted the message before sending. Part of him worried about judgment, or that they would see him as too unusual. He sank onto the couch, flipping on the TV only to mute it seconds later, the images dancing silently before him. His mind was racing. The more he fixated on the idea of becoming Maria, at least in the sense of wearing clothes that mirrored that dreamlike version, the more he felt he was losing his grip on day-to-day life as Mark. Eventually, he drifted into an uneasy sleep on the couch, dress in a folded heap at the other end, unable to make sense of it all. After another week of restless days, Mark arrived at therapy determined to share his mounting concerns. The minute he stepped into the office, though, he noticed a subtle shift in atmosphere. Maybe he was imagining it, but the space felt just a bit colder, and he couldn't quite meet Dr. Aris's gaze. "Mark," she began quietly, "how are you holding up?" He let out a humorless chuckle. "I'm not great." I think I'm losing track of what's real outside these sessions. I keep imagining that if I dress more like Maria, I'll feel better, but it's not always enough." She folded her hands in her lap. "Are you still journaling, practicing other grounding techniques?" "Somewhat," he admitted, "but none of it feels as powerful, and I keep feeling like the only way to be okay is to be Maria. But obviously I can't. I don't know how to integrate that into the rest of my life." A knowing look crossed her face. "It's understandable to want to cling to what soothes you the most, but it's important to differentiate between healthy exploration and relying on one single solution." He clenched his fists in his lap. "So you think this is a problem, that I'm relying too much on Maria?" She paused. "I don't want you to think Maria is a problem in and of herself. This visualization has unlocked a part of you that clearly brings relief. The concern is that you're channeling all your energy into it and neglecting the rest of your coping strategies." He looked away, an ache forming at the base of his skull. "Then what do I do? Because my anxiety is real. I can't just will it away." "I know," she said gently. "We can continue to explore Maria through hypnotherapy, but it might help to set boundaries or goals. For instance, to integrate that calm feeling into your everyday life without necessarily needing to dress as Maria at all times." He bit his lip. "I'm not sure I can do that yet." They went through another guided session. This time, Mark tried to focus on hearing Maria's voice, asking her in that hypnotic world how to balance everything. She responded with a quiet nod, as though understanding his turmoil. Her form was still peaceful, but there was a sense of sadness there too, as if reflecting Mark's own confusion. When Mark emerged from the hypnotic state, tears clung to the corners of his eyes. He quickly wiped them, breathing heavily. A wave of exhaustion replaced the mild euphoria he'd felt before. He vaguely heard Dr. Aris telling him to take it easy for the rest of the day, to consider journaling in detail about the session. He agreed, though his mind felt scattered. That evening, Mark sat in his living room wearing the dress, trying to replicate the calm that so often accompanied it. But he couldn't quite sink into that relief. His thoughts darted anxiously around the question of whether he was using this as a crutch or if there was some deeper meaning. He considered reaching out to Dr. Aris by phone, but worried that he might come across as too dependent. Restless, he decided to drive out of the city to a secluded overlook he liked, in hopes that fresh air might clear his head. He changed out of the dress first, throwing on jeans and a sweatshirt, then grabbed his keys. The overlook, perched on a hill, offered a sprawling view of the city's lights shimmering in the distance. He leaned against a guardrail, inhaling the crisp air. For the first time in a while, he let his mind drift without forcing it to conjure Maria's image. Though the anxiety still hummed beneath his thoughts, he tried to let the scenery ground him. He wondered if it was possible that Maria was more than just a technique for him. He'd never before questioned aspects of his identity so sharply, and yet there was no denying how natural he felt moving in that dress, embodying that persona. At the same time, part of him worried he was deluding himself into thinking it was the only path to relief. Could he learn to channel that comforting energy in any other way? He stayed at the overlook for nearly an hour, letting the city lights merge into an indistinct glow. As the night deepened, he returned home, mind still tangled with questions. A few days later, Mark showed up to therapy again. This time, the conversation took a more probing turn. They discussed the next steps and what strategies might help Mark lessen the sense that he could only feel calm when cross-dressing or under hypnosis. Their dialogue was measured. "I'm not suggesting you stop entirely," said Dr. Aris. "I'm only recommending that you experiment with harnessing that same peacefulness without needing to change your clothes each time. Perhaps you can imagine Maria's presence even when you're wearing your regular outfits." It may lessen the feeling of being split between two worlds. But I want to be Maria, he admitted, though his voice wavered. It's not just a sense of calm anymore. I feel like I am her, at least partly. She nodded. Then maybe we explore that further. But you'll need the emotional tools to handle what that entails in real life, not just in this office or inside your apartment. He swallowed hard. Yeah, that's what scares me. They spent the hour dissecting the emotions attached to that fear, considering practical steps forward. And yet, when the session closed, the same gnawing tension in Mark's chest remained. He felt stuck between wanting to exist as Maria and not knowing how that could function in his day-to-day reality. As the weeks passed, he continued seeking more hypnosis sessions, wanting to remain close to that image of Maria. He also found himself doubling the amount of time he spent at home wearing feminine clothing, occasionally adding a light application of makeup. He experimented with how it felt to paint his nails, how it felt to slip into a pair of low-heeled shoes he'd ordered online. In those moments, the anxiety would recede, but it would always return once he was forced back into his routine life as Mark. Friends began noticing a change in his behavior. He turned down invitations, canceled plans, often citing stress from work. At times, colleagues remarked that he seemed more withdrawn. One of his close friends, Tyler, confronted him in the office break room one morning. "Hey man," Tyler said, voice low. "I'm worried about you. You've been more anxious than usual, and you're always disappearing these days. Is everything okay?" Mark forced a tight smile. "Just a hectic few weeks. You know how it goes." Tyler eyed him carefully. "We haven't hung out in a while. Let's grab a drink or catch a movie sometime. It'll help you unwind." Mark nodded absently. "Sure, maybe soon." But inside, all he really wanted was to go home and dress as Maria, letting that calm wash over him. The idea of socializing felt exhausting. His therapist's sessions remained the one anchor he clung to, even as they became more fraught with unspoken tension. He sensed that Dr. Aris wanted him to embrace coping mechanisms that didn't hinge solely on cross-dressing, but every time he tried, it felt like stepping out of a bubble of safety and into a hurricane. One late afternoon, Mark found himself in Dr. Aris's office again. The lamp cast a gentle glow, the familiar smell of lemon candles drifting through the space. He began the session feeling more tense than usual. He admitted he'd nearly had a panic attack at work the day before. "Let's go deeper today," he blurted out. "I need it. I want to immerse myself in that hypnotic state longer than we usually do." She watched him carefully. "We have an hour, Mark. I'm concerned about overextending. Hypnotherapy can be intense." His voice rose slightly. "I can handle it. I need to reconnect with Maria in a stronger way." Her eyes flickered with concern, but she nodded, and they prepared. Mark closed his eyes, following her voice. Slowly, the mundane world receded, replaced by the rhythmic hush of imaginary waves on that mental shore. He noticed Maria there, waiting, but something was different. She seemed anxious, mirroring the tension in Mark's mind rather than purely exuding calm. He tried to fix the scene, to force the image of her at ease, yet the seascape blurred, and the calm ocean lapped with greater intensity, as if whipped by an unseen storm. It frustrated him. Despite his best efforts, he couldn't make Maria or the scene return to the gentle serenity of previous sessions. He was half aware of Dr. Aris's voice encouraging him to breathe, to let the tension flow out. But it was as though his need for that calm had grown so intense, it was paradoxically pushing it away. Eventually, he felt himself come out of the hypnotic state prematurely, eyes snapping open, chest heaving. A sheen of sweat covered his brow. "Mark?" came her voice, quiet but urgent. "Are you all right?" He pressed his palms to his face. It wouldn't work. I tried to see her like before, but it felt all wrong." Her calm tone guided him back. That can happen. Sometimes pushing too hard disrupts the imagery. Let's take a moment. He swallowed, tears stinging his eyes. I don't want to lose this. It's the only thing that helps. She slid a tissue box closer. You're not losing it entirely, but it may be a signal that we need a different approach. We've been focusing so heavily on Maria that you're placing a lot of pressure on these sessions. Pressure can make it harder to reach that relaxed state. For a moment, anger burned in his chest, fueled by desperation. He wanted to demand that she find a way to fix this, but deep down, he knew it wasn't her fault. He was the one who had grown obsessed with one coping mechanism. He left that day feeling hollow and unsettled. The usual post-session calm was absent, leaving him with an unsettling dread that perhaps he'd lost the only method that had ever given him genuine relief. As time rolled on, Mark began to confront the reality that simply relying on wearing feminine clothing and conjuring Maria under hypnosis might not carry him through every obstacle. He still found comfort in cross-dressing at home, but the euphoria was less intense, overshadowed by the fear that it might slip away. He and Dr. Aris continued to meet, though tension lingered in their conversations. She didn't discourage him from wearing feminine attire, nor did she suggest he abandon the idea of Maria. Rather, she insisted he develop additional ways to cope. Slowly, Mark began incorporating a more routine meditation practice. He started a basic exercise regimen, nothing too intense, just morning stretches and occasional weekend hikes. Bit by bit, he noticed that on days he couldn't wear the dress, or when the hypnotic sessions felt less profound, he still had a handful of smaller tools that could keep him from spiraling. It wasn't as dramatic or all-encompassing as the full immersion in Maria, but it prevented the worst of his panic. I still want to explore Maria, he confessed in one session. But maybe it doesn't have to be every moment of my life. That's progress, she noted gently, though carefully avoiding words he had once mentioned disliking. Let's continue exploring in a balanced way. He nodded, feeling a cautious relief that he hadn't felt in a long while. In the weeks that followed, Mark learned to see cross-dressing as a valuable part of his mental health journey, something that brought him comfort and eased his anxious mind. But he also recognized it as one piece in a larger puzzle. When he felt especially tense in public settings, he would discreetly press his fingertips against his wrist, remembering the softness of that pale blue dress's fabric. He'd recall the hush of waves from his visualization, the gentle tilt of Maria's head, and find a small pocket of relief in the middle of a busy day. He no longer requested daily sessions from Dr. Aris, scaling back to a more sustainable schedule. He channeled his energy into journaling each evening. It wasn't easy. There were days he still yearned to slip on that feminine outfit the moment he got home and remain in it until he fell asleep. But he tried not to rely on it as his only method of controlling anxiety. Sometimes he'd force himself to relax in casual pajamas or read a book until his nerves settled. Other times, though, he would indeed put on the skirt or the dress, feeling an immediate sigh of relief as the tension ebbed from his shoulders. There was a balance emerging. The line between Mark and Maria was still there, but it felt less like an unbridgeable chasm. Instead, it became a fluid boundary, a place he could cross when he needed peace, and then return without feeling trapped or frantic. One mild afternoon, near the end of another session, Dr. Aris leaned back in her chair. The lighting in the room was as subdued as always, but Mark felt more stable than he had on that first day or on those desperate visits that followed. "You've come a long way," she said softly, eyes meeting his. "How do you feel about continuing our work together?" He inhaled. "I think we're on the right path. I'm still relying on Maria's image, and I still sometimes wear the clothes, but it doesn't feel like my entire world collapses if I can't do that every moment." She offered a faint smile. "Good to hear. We can keep examining these questions. Just remember, it's okay if it continues to evolve. He gave a slow nod. I appreciate that. And I appreciate not being judged for everything. Her expression was gentle. My role is to support you and help you find ways to handle your anxiety. He stood and gathered his things, feeling that subtle calm that now frequently graced him after sessions. Once outside, he paused on the sidewalk, letting the sun's warmth settle on his skin. He wasn't sure exactly what the future held, how the concept of Maria might fit into the rest of his life, or whether he would someday tell close friends and family about this part of himself. He didn't know if he'd ever venture out in public in a dress or openly embrace the feminine persona he'd discovered in a more visible way. But for now, he felt a fragile sense of harmony. At home, he sometimes reflected on the therapy session that had started it all. He remembered the powerful moment he'd first seen that archetype of himself as a woman on the beach. The memory still held a mysterious beauty for him. He didn't want to lose that connection. At the same time, he saw how important it was to build up other tools, other ways of managing life's inevitable strains. Late one night, with the apartment bathed in the soft glow of a single lamp, Mark slipped on the pale blue dress again. He stood in front of the mirror, observing how it draped over his body. He felt a familiar wave of calm and let it blanket him gently. Closing his eyes, he pictured the beach from his hypnosis, the crashing waves, the warm sand. Maria was there, though perhaps less a separate figure and more like a facet of himself. The tension in his shoulders eased. He breathed out, a small smile curling the corners of his mouth. No matter what difficulties might come, he'd found a path to some relief, even if it was a complex path, one that would require continued patience and exploration. The memory of that first session with Dr. Eris still resonated, reminding him of how far he had come. And though his life was far from perfect, he found himself grateful for Maria's presence, grateful for the discovery that even the deepest anxieties could be met with a quiet voice that told him he didn't have to face them alone. He turned away from the mirror, stepping into the living room. Soft music played in the background. Outside, the city lights glowed, but inside, the hush felt comforting. He moved across the room with gentle steps, letting the hem of the dress brush against his legs. The person in the reflection was still Mark, always Mark. Yet he also felt the stirrings of that other presence, so steady and reassuring. For now, he let them coexist, twining together into a harmony he hoped would guide him forward. And in that moment, everything was still enough, calm enough, for him to believe that better days were truly within reach.
Did you like the story? Hit that like button and tell me what you thought in the comments. Do you want to hear more stories? Subscribe and hit the bell. For exclusive content and early access, check out our Patreon. You can find the link in the description, or you can watch any of the videos shown on my right. Thank you for watching and see you in the next video.